For our next speaker, I mean, I literally saw how, as he was walking in the hall a few minutes ago, like people stopped their conversations and turned and said, this is the next speaker. So we have a really interesting session coming up. And to introduce our next speaker, I would like to call Anshu Agarwal on stage. Anshu has the very impressive distinction of being a part of not one, not two, not three, not four, but 5 successful exit journeys. These days, she's a venture capitalist. She seeds early scale startups. She is from IIT Roorkee, yay Roorkee, and I'll turn the stage over to her. Please please join me in helping welcome Anshu to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you, Swapnil. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is that time of the day, so if you are feeling sleepy, this next talk will totally wake you up. And more importantly, it will give you a break from AI, okay? All right, so there are a few stories in Silicon Valley which are as consequential as Tyler Shultz's story. At just 22 years of age, he took upon Theranos and exposed $9 billion fraud. That story is deeply personal to him. And it is a great honor for me to welcome Tyler Shultz onto the stage. Please join me.
Yeah. Thank you all for having me. I'm really excited to share my story with all of you and then get to some questions that reflect on that story. So I first met Elizabeth Holmes when I was 20 years old. I was a junior at Stanford, and my grandfather happened to live and work on campus at the time. And one day, he called me up and said, hey, I'm having this brilliant woman come over for a discussion, and I think you would learn a lot if you came over and listened in. So I hopped on my bike, and I biked over to his house, and that's where I met Elizabeth Holmes for the first time. She was wearing her all-black outfit, you know, the black turtleneck that was very much intentionally modeled after Steve Jobs. I heard her deep, monotone, almost hypnotic voice, and saw her piercing, unblinking blue eyes, and that's when I heard her story for the first time and the vision for Theranos for the first time. And what she told us was that she dropped out of Stanford when she was 19 years old and invented this revolutionary technology in her uncle's basement that was capable of testing for anything that a central laboratory could test for, but with just a single drop of blood. And what was more impressive was that these tests could be run you didn't need the central laboratory infrastructure, so these tests could be run anywhere where you had access to electricity. So these tests could be run in battlefields, in helicopters, in operating rooms, in Walgreens, in Safeways, in patients' homes. It really just seemed like a technology that had no limitations. So I knew this was something I wanted to be a part of. I was totally captivated by Elizabeth and this vision. So my very first job out of college was at Theranos. And I joined the company at a very interesting time because after being in stealth mode for 11 years, I joined the company on the day that we launched the product. So Elizabeth did this big ribbon cutting ceremony at the first Walgreens that would have these quote unquote Edison devices. It was just so exciting time to be there. But at the same time, you could tell right off the bat how tumultuous it was. Because again, on that first day, I was standing with a group of scientists, and someone came over and said, Sarika's out in the parking lot crying. If you want to say goodbye, you have to run out now. And I didn't know who this person was, but the story that we learned was that she was the manager of the assay validation team. And this team was in charge of making sure that the tests worked before they were tested on real patients. And she had gone on like a vacation, and before she left, she told Elizabeth and Sunny, these tests are not ready, you cannot launch them. And then she came back, and the product had been launched. But my manager pulled our team aside, and in retrospect, this was a big red flag, but not a single person that I worked with in my lab had ever seen the product we were working on. But what our manager told us was that even though we had just launched this product, there were 0 tests that had been validated on the Theranos platform. So if a patient walked into Walgreens on that day, first of all, they would not get the promised finger prick. They would get a needle in the arm. And then none of those tests would be run on the Theranos equipment. We would either dilute the blood and run it on third-party equipment, or we would just send the samples out to labs that we contracted with. So it was really confusing. You know, we just did this big launch, but what was it that we really launched? It was nothing. It was the facade of a launch. And then by the end of my first week, the research team that I was working in, we all got moved into the validation team because so many people had quit from that team, and Elizabeth and Sunny just needed more, really, they would say, like, bodies on the front line of the company. And they really drew on that analogy, so much so that the lab that held all of the Edison devices was literally called Normandy. So by the end of my first week, my lab was all sent down to Normandy. And as part of our onboarding into this lab, we saw what was called this quote-unquote open reader. So it was the Theranos device that didn't have the fancy shell on it, so you could see exactly what was inside, you could see exactly what it was doing. And I so vividly remember my manager seeing this with me for the first time, and she looked at it, and she turned to the woman who was giving us the demo, and she just said, "Do you think this is cool?" And the woman shrugged her shoulders and said, "I'll let you decide for yourself." And in that moment, I realized that there was an open secret at this company that the technology flat out did not exist. Because what we saw was an 8-channel pipette on a robotic arm. There was no new signal transduction method. There were no microfluidics. There was nothing that that device could do that I couldn't do with my own hand and a pipette and a plate reader. It wasn't even a standalone device. So the Theranos product wasn't accurate enough to do the dilution step out of the nanotainer. So first you had to put the nanotainer into this very advanced, large, expensive pipetting robot made by a company called Tecan. And then you would put the Theranos cartridge into the device. And then it could only test for one thing at a time. So even though there were no tests that were validated, even if you had validated these tests and you came in and you were promised hundreds of tests from a single drop of blood, each device could only run one test. So this isn't even coming anywhere close to what Elizabeth is claiming. But the worst part is that the data we were getting was wildly inaccurate. But by the time that I left the company, we actually had 7 tests that had passed validation, and we were actually running real patient samples for those 7 tests. And once you start testing real patients, obviously you have to start abiding by some federal regulations. And when the regulators came, and I really just felt like we cheated on all of the regulations that we were supposed to abide by. And when the CLIA regulators came in to inspect our laboratory, we literally locked the doors to the labs, to Normandy, the lab that had all of the Theranos devices. And the regulators were only shown the third-party equipment that were made by companies like Siemens and Roche. So again, that was a huge indicator to me that management was intentionally hiding something from regulators. We cheated on something called proficiency testing as well. And then a lot of these problems really came to a head for me when we validated a test for syphilis. And we were seeing just an enormous amount of variation in the syphilis results. We tested we tested samples that were known to be positive for syphilis, and we were not identifying enough of them correctly as having syphilis. And then we tested ourselves and our colleagues using this machine, assuming that we would be testing negative samples, and like over 20% of us tested positive for syphilis. And we all literally laughed. Nobody thought that these tests worked. Nobody took it seriously. No one thought, hey, let's send out a company-wide email and say something's going around. But we put all the data together, and we sent it to the statistics team, and somehow it passed their criteria. The medical director of the company, who's a licensed MD, signed off on this report and said this test is safe and effective, and we are going to start testing real patients for syphilis. And when the lab got that news, most of my lab mates celebrated because that meant we didn't have to repeat all of this testing we had done. But I felt like I'd been physically punched in the stomach. I felt sick. Like I felt like I might throw up because I felt like something I was directly contributing to, without a shred of a doubt, was going to severely hurt somebody. So I knew I had to start doing more. I knew I had to start speaking up. So I talked to my friends and colleagues, to my managers, to a vice president, ultimately to the president and COO of the company, to the CEO, Elizabeth herself, to my grandfather who was on the board of directors, and nothing ever happened. I barked up every tree I could possibly bark up. They chased me out of the building. On my last day, I got an email from the president of the company, whose name was Sonny, and he basically said that I was arrogant, ignorant, patronizing, reckless, that I had no understanding of basic math, science, or statistics, and that if I had any other last name, that I would have already been held accountable in the strongest way. So when I got that email, I just replied and said, consider this my 2 weeks' notice, and I left that day. And so obviously I was so frustrated by going through all these channels and no one was listening to me. And even though I'm not part of the company anymore, Elizabeth lands herself on the cover of Forbes and Fortune and Inc. magazine. She becomes the youngest self-made female billionaire. And I just know this is all essentially made up. So when a Wall Street Journal reporter reached out to me saying that he was digging into Theranos, I could not help myself but to connect with that reporter. But at the same time, I was so afraid that I was going to have to prove to Elizabeth, open my phone and scroll through my call logs to prove to her that I had not spoken to the reporter, that I went and I actually bought a burner phone with cash to call this Wall Street Journal reporter. And when I called him, I said in addition to being so concerned about patient health, that I was also concerned about my grandfather's reputation, because I told this reporter he was part of the Nixon administration during Watergate. He was the Secretary of Treasury. And then he was the Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan during the Iran-Contra scandal. And I said he made it out of both of these with his integrity completely intact. So there was no doubt in my mind that if he was given the opportunity, he would make things right with the people that Elizabeth had hurt. And I wanted to make sure he had that opportunity before he passed away. So that was part of my motivation for becoming a source for the Wall Street Journal. And I also thought that I was so sneaky with the burner phone with cash that no one would ever figure out that I was a source. But I guess maybe unsurprisingly, it did not take them very long to figure out that I was involved in this. They ultimately, when they figured out that I was a source, they had an intense pressure campaign to try to get me to take back the statements that I had made to the Wall Street Journal. They hid lawyers in my grandfather's house without me knowing they were there. I had a private conversation with my grandfather with 2 Theranos lawyers essentially in the room over. They hired private investigators to follow me. They threatened me with lawsuits. There were times when I went to bed at night with a notice to appear in court the following morning, but I would wake up to an email saying they would give me more time to negotiate. And I ended up needing to get a very specialized IP attorney. I had a criminal defense lawyer, a defamation lawyer, a litigator, and whistleblowing attorneys. And I ended up spending between $400,000 and $500,000 just to not give in. And I still am not allowed to say exactly what was in these affidavits, but they were trying to get me to retract statements I had made to the Wall Street Journal. And at one point, my parents sat me down, and they just could not understand why I was continuing this fight. And they said, we learned that the best case scenario if we go to court is that we will spend $2 million and win. And in the worst case scenario, we will spend more money than that, and then you will go to prison. Why would you choose either of these options? Just give up. This is not your responsibility. This is the responsibility of the FDA, of the FBI, of the SEC, of the DOJ. This is not your problem anymore. But what I told my parents was the things that they are trying to get me to say under penalty of perjury in these affidavits just are not true. And I'm not going to admit that I'm wrong when I know with 100% certainty that I'm right, and I was determined to see this through. And at the time, it felt like I would lose. I knew the truth was on my side, but it felt like the truth absolutely counted for nothing. It felt like the only thing that mattered was how much money you could spend. But even though there were times when I had lost hope, I really did feel like the fight was still one that was worth having. And my parents were incredibly supportive of me. Even after we would fight, they would say, we support you no matter what. We would sell our house to pay for your legal fees. Luckily, it never came to that. My mom even told me, they're trying to take your money. They could take all your money. They could take all our money. They could take our house. But the things that are most important to you, they can't take away. They can't take away your family, your youth, your creativity, your education, your friends, the things that are most important they cannot take away. And that was just so empowering to me to really keep up this fight. And eventually, the Wall Street Journal started publishing their reporting about Theranos. And honestly, after the first article, I was a little bit disappointed. I felt like the reporter had pulled some punches. But what I didn't realize was that he had planned out a series of articles. It wasn't just the one. And over a period of about a year, his reporting ended up leading to investigations by the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, who came in and said that Theranos had practices that put patients' health in immediate jeopardy. The FDA came in and said that Theranos was selling an unregulated medical device. Eventually, the SEC did an investigation and said that Elizabeth had conducted a massive, years-long fraud. And actually, the SEC even found instances where Elizabeth told prospective investors that their revenue the previous year was $100 million. And in reality, their revenue the previous year was $100,000. And so she was lying by many, many orders of magnitude. And it took a long time, but eventually the truth did count for a lot. And just about 2 years ago, Elizabeth and Sunny were both convicted of fraud and are now serving an 11 and 14-year prison sentence. And honestly, at one point I decided to go on the record with my story, and since that decision, my life has just been getting better and better and better, almost like month over month. I ended up marrying someone who I lived with while I worked at Theranos, one of my best friends. We now have 2 children together, a 2-year-old and a 3-month-old. I went on to start 2 diagnostics companies myself. One of them still exists, but I'm just not part of it anymore. And now I've actually decided to dedicate a portion of my life to speaking more intentionally about this story and the lessons that we can all learn from it. And it's just been such an amazing experience for me to be able to come to places like this and audiences like you all and help turn what was the most negative experience of my life into a positive one. So I hope that we're all able to remain engaged after this. Please connect on LinkedIn, come say hi. But now I think we have a few questions lined up so we can kind of reflect back on this experience a little bit. But thank you so much. And as I am trying to do more speaking, the best way for me to do more speaking is actually just to collect testimonials and reviews from you all and remain connected. So if you could take a minute and fill out this form, I would be hugely grateful. Thank you so much.
Wow. I'd only heard about this, but Tyler's talk does give you goosebumps, does it not? All right, so
it's a hard story to fit into 15 to 20 minutes, so
yeah,
I rushed through it a bit.
Thank you. So there are lots of founders and investors here, and therefore, on behalf of all of them, I have a few questions.
Great.
Okay. Please
you want to sit down? Or?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So my first question is, how can founders be more intentional about setting the right culture for their business from day one?
Yeah, so I think a great takeaway from this story is that Elizabeth and Sunny really understood how to build a culture, albeit a very misguided one, but they understood that you have to be very intentional for a very long period of time to set the culture that you want to set. And Elizabeth and Sunny very much wanted to build a culture of fear, where no one would stand up to them and people would just do exactly as they were told. And they did this in a number of ways. It was the overarching NDAs. I signed like 3 different NDAs with them. And those NDAs were so strong that I felt like when I reached out to government regulators that I was breaking my NDA. That's how strong they made you, that's how restrictive they made you feel. So when I reached out to government regulators, I used a fake name, a fake email address, and I requested that this alias be anonymous. So I had an anonymous alias when I reached out to these government regulators. When I joined, they gave me a list of words that I wasn't allowed to say when describing my job to other people. And these were words like biology, research, pipette. They told you not to talk to your spouse about what your job was. Wow. You were told not to talk to your colleagues about your work. And when people spoke up, like the woman did on my very first day, you were immediately fired. And in some cases, after those employees were fired, they were then sued. And when Theranos sued employees, they would then send out company-wide emails about it, where if you read in between the lines, they were basically saying, "We will sue you too." And so people just stopped speaking up. And instead of speaking up, they would quietly leave. And when the people who have problems with what's happening quietly leave over 10 years, the type of people who are left is the exact culture that Elizabeth and Sunny were going for. They were the type of people who would just do whatever they were told. They were not going to speak up. And instead of speaking up, they would just quietly leave.
Wow.
So what founders need to do, I know there's a lot of founders here, is think about the culture you want to set. Think about the core values that you hold individually and that you want your company to hold, and then create conditions that reinforce those values and try to create positive feedback loops at every possible opportunity instead of these negative feedback loops that Elizabeth and Sunny implemented.
Wow, that's a great advice. My second question is, founders have to sell, I was a founder myself, so have lived through it. Founders have to sell their big vision to investors and employees. Sometimes the traction does not materialize fully. Where is the line in the fake it till you make it mentality?
Yeah, so it's a pretty tough question, and there are some defenders of Elizabeth who will still just say, you know, she was employing this fake it till you make it strategy that a lot of companies use and a lot of companies have done successfully. And I actually think that that term fake it till you make it has morphed into something completely different than how it originally started. And I think it became very popular by Dropbox. And Dropbox created this very convincing demo of what Dropbox could look like, and they posted it on YouTube. And it got a bunch of views, and they got tens of thousands of people to sign up for the wait list. They took the wait list and they brought it to a venture capital firm and said, look at all the people who want to buy this product. All we need is money to build it. The VCs invested, they built the product, the rest is history. You know, they built the product, sold it to the people off the wait list. Dropbox is a huge success, and people said they faked it till they made it, because they created this very convincing demo. But to me, they did very, very thorough market due diligence, and they made sure they had a product market fit before they invested a tremendous amount of resources into building it. Now, because it has this catchy phrase, fake it till you make it, I think people misunderstand what it means. And now I think a lot of founders mean that it's okay to pretend that it works when it doesn't. And what Dropbox didn't do was take anybody's money before the product was ready. They didn't launch a product that didn't work. And then you fast forward to Theranos, and what they did was pretend it works when it doesn't. And there are other examples of this as well. Like there's that company Nikola that had the hydrogen-powered cars where the only emissions would be water. They had this amazing video that showed the semi-truck that looked like it was driving.
I remember that.
But a hedge fund actually figured out that the car was rolling downhill, and they just tilted the frame to make it look like the car was driving. And that's another example where, to me, that's not fake it till you make it the way that Dropbox did it. This is pretending it works when it doesn't, and that is fraud. And as a founder, I think you need to be really careful in towing that line.
That's right. Yeah, well, so the other part of the founder is that to construct the board. It's very important, and board oversight is critical, as you witnessed it yourself. How did the Theranos board enable this fraud? And how should we go about constructing our boards?
So I say, and my grandfather was on the board, so I have to say, though, that the board was negligent at best. I'm actually shocked that they have not been held more accountable than they have been, because the board was clearly made to transfer their credibility to Elizabeth. They were not truly there to provide any form of governance. And looking back, there are all kinds of red flags about the board. The average age was 80 years old. That is too old to be the average age of your board. They were all men. They were all white. They all had a background in government. You had very little to no expertise in medicine. And to me, it seemed like they really treated Elizabeth more like the prettiest girl on the playground than they did a CEO. And like, I even listened to Henry Kissinger, another former Secretary of State, read her a limerick that he wrote for her, where the punchline was, "You're not the next Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was an earlier you." Oh, wow. So you had these old men who were just fawning over her. And then Elizabeth is going around and making claims to investors, saying that these devices are being used in medevac helicopters on the front lines in Afghanistan. And you have a 4-star general sitting on the board who then became the Secretary of Defense. So if you're an investor seeing that statement and that a Secretary of Defense is sitting on the board, who better in the world would know if that is true than a 4-star general Secretary of Defense? So it almost made the investors feel like diligence wasn't even necessary. Okay. So the board was incredibly helpful to Elizabeth in enabling this fraud. And my last point about this is that the board, if you forget everything else, if you're a board member, the one sacred duty of a board is to put in place a good CEO, a competent CEO, and remove a bad one. And the board forgot that sacred duty. When the Wall Street Journal started publishing on Theranos, they saw their jobs as protecting themselves in their own vested interests because they were way overcompensated. And they saw their job as making sure Elizabeth did not go to prison. And that is not the job of a board. A board does not work for the CEO works for the board.
Yes. Okay. This is my last question, and it's very important because now I have moved to the dark side and there are lots of investors here. So what can we learn from the failure of due diligence on the part of the investors?
Yeah, so I mean, we talked about how big these lies were in the SEC filings. And the investors just did an astounding lack of due diligence. Elizabeth raised her last, I think, about $700 million without an investor ever seeing a financial statement. So Elizabeth took the typical angel round model where you go to wealthy individuals and you have coffee or dinner or beer and they say, I believe in you, I believe in the vision, I'm going to put $50,000, $100,000 into this. And she took that model and essentially scaled it up to $100+ million checks. She got individual wealthy people to cut over $100 million checks each. But what's interesting, if you look at her set of investors, is that there were no institutional Silicon Valley VCs. It was all wealthy individuals. So I've spoken to top partners at law firm, or at VCs like Sequoia, like Google Ventures, like Khosla Ventures. In fact, there's a venture capitalist joining this stage in about an hour.
That's right.
Who I know she pitched. And they all say some version of the same thing, which is that, of course, Elizabeth pitched them. They went and they visited the company. They put together a team. They ran a diligence process. That process said, do not invest, and they didn't. And that is like the least sexy story of all time. We ran a process and it worked, right? Mm-hmm. But it really shows you how important these processes are. And when you put them in place, to not evade them. Because people like Rupert Murdoch and Betsy DeVos, they are wealthy individuals, but they have family offices. And they have accountants, and they have processes, but Elizabeth was able to evade those processes. So when you've hired consultants, when you've hired experts, when you've put in place a process, follow the process, because individual decision makers make very bad decisions.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we spend a lot of time in diligence, but so I'm glad to hear that, diligence does uncover problems. Yes,
yes.
Yes.
Well, and I would even make the argument that that is why the LPs put money into your fund, is because they expect you to go do that diligence.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Tyler. This has been extremely valuable to the audience.
Yes, thank you.
And I really, really appreciate you coming here.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.